All right, how is everyone doing today? Well, today we are starting part 3 of 1984 by George Orwell. So this is chapter 1 of part 3. Yesterday we read through chapter 9 of part 2. That was very long. That took us 5 hours to get through that. That was the longest video I've ever made in my life. Okay, but usually these are about 1 hour or 2 hours long. So I think that we can imagine that this one will also just be about 1 or 2 hours long. If you're new to seeing this video, this is not a typical reading of 1984. We are going to read it very slowly and talk about any vocabulary that we identify. So when I see a word that I think will be useful for you in your life, or useful for you on a test or something like that, I'll stop and talk about that word for a little bit. So I won't stop and talk about every word that we see. Or if I see a phrase that I think you probably wouldn't understand, if the meaning isn't obvious, then we will stop and talk about it. And if you're watching it live, then I really encourage you to ask questions in the chat, and I will be very happy to answer your questions about the vocabulary or phrases that we go through. I want you to do that. It makes the video more interesting. That's what is interesting about watching this video, is your questions. All right, well, in chapter 9 of part 2, where we finished, Winston had been caught by the government, and so was his lover, Julia. And we don't know what happened to them. So in this chapter, we will find out what happens to Winston and Julia. He was just arrested in their secret apartment where they were having their affair. So that's where we left off. He did not know where he was, so the police took him somewhere. Presumably, he was in the Ministry of Love. That word presumably is like a fancy way of saying, I guess, I imagine, it seems like, it looks like. So, I guess he was in the Ministry of Love. We think he was in the Ministry of Love. Presumably, he was in the Ministry of Love. But there was no way of making certain. He was in a high-ceilinged, the ceiling is the top. When you say roof, that's like the outside of the building, but when you say ceiling, that's the part of the top that you can see from the inside. So if you say the ceiling, a high-ceilinged room, it means the room was very tall. A high-ceilinged, windowless cell with walls of glittering white porcelain. Do you know what glitter is? Let's take a look at glitter for a minute. Where's my... It's not a terribly important word. I think it's used more as a verb than it is as a noun. Unless you're a child, maybe, or you like to make crafts. Because glitter is like this shiny material that you can use to decorate things. But as a verb, it means a lot of little shiny areas. You know, imagine something being covered in glitter. He was in a high-ceilinged, windowless cell with walls of glittering white porcelain. Concealed lamps, concealed means hidden, flooded it with cool light, and there was a low, steady humming sound. Humming is, if you have a song in your head and you say, that's humming. But when you're talking about lights especially, or maybe something with electrical sounds, could be something like so that's the loud humming sound. which he supposed had something to do with the air supply. So maybe it was like an air conditioner or a heater or something like that, or an air filter. A bench or shelf was just wide enough to sit on. A bench or shelf just wide enough to sit on ran round the wall. So it's an empty cell, but there's a bench, there's like a long chair that goes around the wall. At the end opposite the door, a lavatory pan with no wooden seat. There were 4 telescreens, one on each wall. So there was a pan, but that was for going to the bathroom. There was a dull aching in his belly. It had been there ever since they had bundled him into the closed van and drove him away. Just in case you don't know what a van is, because sometimes even somebody who's pretty advanced doesn't know exactly what a van is. So let me just show you very quickly a picture of a van. These are vans. This is a van. There was a dull aching in his belly. It had been there ever since they had bundled. Bundle. You know, bundle is like a collection of things. So if you have a bundle of money, it's like a big stack of money, like a big collection of money. But also, I wonder what happens if I just type the word bundle, what kind of pictures it shows. This is not what I would have pictured, but I understand it. So a bundle, you see how this is a collection of books? You can call that a bundle of books. Even this package you could call, on the top left, you could call a bundle. So bundle is when things are put together somehow. And just like I was describing, here's a bundle of money. A bundle of sticks. Well, you get the idea, right? But also, if you live somewhere cold, or if you've ever been really cold, wait, let me see if I can find a picture of this. Like for example, I grew up in a very cold place, and so in the winter time, if I was going outside, then my mother would say, "Bundle up," and that means put on a lot of things: a hat, a scarf, a very thick coat, gloves. That's bundling up. But you could also do it like when you're relaxing at home. It could be like, let me see, like this. You see the picture of this woman here? I would say that she is bundled in her bed because she's wrapped in her bed with all of these comfortable things. So bundle is actually kind of a nice, warm, comfortable thing usually, but not here. Let's see how they're using it here. Here it's horrible. There was a dull aching in his belly. It had been there ever since they had bundled him into the closed van. Because they use the word bundle, I picture that they covered him with something very heavy so no one could see him and he couldn't see out. I don't know if that's what they mean, but that's the thing that I picture when I see that or when I read that. They had bundled him into the closed van, and I think when they say closed, that means no windows, and driven him away. But he was also hungry, with a gnawing, unwholesome kind of hunger. Gnawing. How can we... Let's take a look at that. Gnawing is what animals do. You see, this is an animal gnawing at a, I don't know what that is, a bar. It's kind of like eating, like very slow eating. Eating little pieces until something is destroyed. This is a destruction due to gnawing. Gnaw. Gnaw. That's kind of a funny spelling of that word, but that's how you spell it. Let me put that here. Gnawing. So when he says gnawing hunger, I think that what that means is the hunger is always there, kind of eating little pieces of his stomach. You know, it's always there, never going away, getting bigger and bigger, something like that. That's how I would imagine that. With a gnawing, unwholesome kind of hunger. It might be 24 hours since he had eaten. It might be 36. He still did not know, probably never would know, whether it had been morning or evening when they arrested him. Since he was arrested, he had not been fed. He sat still as he could on the narrow bench, with his hands crossed on his knee. He had already learned to sit still. If you made unexpected movements, they yelled at you from the telescreen. So if you moved at all, the telescreen would say, "Don't move." But the craving for food was growing upon him. I'm just going to put the word craving here. That's a good word, and if you don't know it, it's a word that you should know. Craving is when you want something very badly, when you feel a very strong desire for something. You must have that thing to stop this feeling. So if you're craving food, you must have food, or this feeling will not go away from you. Oh, I forgot to take off gnawing. So we're talking about craving here. You probably already know that word, but if you don't, that's a very good word. So you can say something like, "I'm craving ice cream." And that means I must have ice cream. I'm obsessed with ice cream. I won't stop thinking about ice cream until I eat some. He had already learned to sit still. If you made unexpected movements, they yelled at you from the telescreen. But the craving for food was growing upon him. What he longed for, above all, was a piece of bread. And again, this is a very interesting thing. To long for something. When you long for something, you have to say, "Oh, I long for," use long as a verb, and then you say an object. "I long for ice cream." That means I want ice cream really, really, really badly. You can say, "I long for you." That sounds like I'm in love with you. I want you really, really badly. I must have you here with me. That's I long for you. So to long for something is to want or need something very much. Let's see, what did Winston long for? The craving for food was growing upon him. What he longed for, above all, was a piece of bread. So all he wanted was just a piece of bread, really, really badly. He wanted it. He had an idea that there were a few breadcrumbs in the pocket of his overalls. It was even possible, he thought, this because from time to time something seemed to tickle his leg. Tickle is tickle, tickle, tickle. That's tickling. So something seemed to tickle his leg. Something was like touching his leg in a soft way. There might be a sizable bit of crust there. In the end, the temptation to find out overcame his fear. He slipped a hand into his pocket. "Smith!" yelled the voice from the telescreen. 6079 Smith W. Hands out of pockets in cells. He sat still, his hands crossed on his knee. Before being brought here, he had been taken to another place, which must have been an ordinary prison or temporary lockup used by the patrols. He did not know how long he had been there, some hours at any rate. With no clocks and no daylight, it was hard to gauge the time. This word gauge, that's a word that we should take a look at. So let me put it up here, gauge. This is gauge, has a funny spelling. But let me show you a picture of a gauge as a noun. A gauge is something that you use to measure other things. So you can find all different kinds of gauges. Although Google only shows one type of gauge. There are many. The information in your car, your speed, your gas, your air pressure, those are all gauges. They don't show them here, which is funny. They only show one type of gauge. Let's see. I'll just type car gauge. You see, these are measuring things. How much gas do you have? How fast you are going? How far? Those are all gauges. So what do you think you could use gauge for as a verb? To measure something. It was difficult to measure. Let's see, what was he having difficulty measuring? They had put him into a cell similar to... Oh, wait. No, that's not right. Ortiq Beck says hello. Hi, Ortiq Beck. He did not know how long he had been there. Some hours at any rate. With no clocks and no daylight, it was hard to gauge the time. So without a clock or even to look at the sun, it was hard to gauge, to measure the time. It was a noisy, evil-smelling place. They had put him into a cell similar to the one he was now in, but filthily dirty, and at all times crowded by 10 or 15 people. The majority of them were common criminals, but there were a few political prisoners among them. He had sat silent against the wall, jostled by dirty bodies. Jostling is when people bump into you, move you around, push you. Like if you're in a very crowded place, like a very crowded market, and people push you, it's jostling. Too preoccupied by fear and the pain in his belly to take much interest in his surroundings, but still noticing an astonishing difference in demeanor between the party prisoners and the others. The party prisoners were always silent and terrified, but the ordinary criminals seemed to care nothing for anybody. So the party prisoners knew that they were going to die, but the common criminals, the thieves or whatever, the people who hurt other people, they weren't so scared or terrified or worried about what would happen to them. They yelled insults at the guards, fought back fiercely with their belongings, were impounded. Their belongings were impounded. When something is impounded, it means that usually the government, I guess it could be other authorities, but usually the government takes something and puts it away so that you don't have access to it. But I think yesterday we were talking about the word seize, the government seizing something from you. And the difference between impound and seize is that when you use the verb to seize, it sounds like they're taking it from you and they will never return it. But when something is impounded, you can usually get it returned to you. So, for example, in the US, if you park your car in the wrong spot, the government will come and take it and put it in a special place. And you will have to go to that place and you will have to pay money to receive your car. The government didn't seize your car. They didn't take it forever. They impounded it. You can go to this place, pay money, and you will have your car returned to you. If you go to prison, the prison will take all of your things from you while you're living in the prison. But then when you leave, they'll return it to you. So that's like impounding your belongings. It's not seizing. It's not taking forever. It's kind of like taking temporarily. They yelled insults at the guards, fought back fiercely with their belongings, when their belongings were impounded. So the jail, the prison, took their belongings, but the idea is it will be returned when they leave. Wrote obscene words on the floors, ate smuggled food which they produced from mysterious hiding places in their clothes, and even shouted down the telescreen when it tried to restore order. On the other hand, some of them seemed to be on good terms with the guards, called them by nicknames, and tried to wheedle cigarettes through the spy hole in the door. The guards, too, treated the common criminals with a certain forbearance. To forbear something means to tolerate something. So the guards were a little bit kinder, a little bit more tolerant of the common criminals, even when they had to handle them roughly. There was much talk about the forced labor camps to which most of the prisoners expected to be sent. It was all right in the camps, he gathered, so long as you had good contacts and knew the ropes. To know the ropes means to know how to manipulate the situation, to know how to navigate the situation. It could mean to be very familiar with the system. It could be very familiar with the people. How to get along, how to survive. That's knowing the ropes. So it was all right to be in the labor camp if you knew the ropes, if you knew how to act, if you knew how to manage the system, if you knew people, maybe. There was bribery, favoritism, and racketeering of every kind. There was homosexuality and prostitution. There was even illicit alcohol distilled from potatoes. The positions of trust were given only to the common criminals, especially the gangsters and the murderers, who formed a sort of aristocracy. All the dirty jobs were done by the politicals. There was a constant come and go of prisoners of every description. Drug peddlers. To peddle something means to sell something in the street. So a drug peddler is someone who goes in the street and sells drugs. But, if you live in a place where people are allowed to walk down the street saying, buy my vegetables, buy my chocolate, those are peddlers. Thieves, bandits, black marketeers, drunks, prostitutes. Some of the drunks were so violent that the other prisoners had to combine to suppress them. An enormous wreck of a woman, aged about 60, with great tumbling breasts and thick coils of white hair which had come down in her struggles, was carried in, kicking and shouting, by 4 guards who had hold of her, one at each corner. They wrenched off the boots with which she had been trying to kick them, and dumped her down across Winston's lap, almost breaking his thigh bones. The woman hoisted herself. Hoist is like a big lift. The woman hoisted herself upright and followed them out with a yell of, "Effin' bastards!" Then, noticing that she was sitting on something uneven, she slid off Winston's knees onto the bench. "Beg pardon, dearie," she said. "I wouldn't have sat on you. Only the buggers put me there." So that "I wouldn't have sat on you," that is, I would not have sat on you. I wouldn't have sat on you. And in conversational English, it's I wouldn't. So I would not have sat on you. In conversational English, it sounds like I wouldn't have sat on you. Only the buggers put me there. So buggers, that's used mostly in the UK as an insult. But the buggers put me there. They don't know how to treat a lady. They don't know how to treat a lady. They don't know how. They don't know how. They don't know how to treat a lady. They don't know how to treat a lady. They don't know how to treat a lady, do they? She paused, patted her breast, and belched. Belching is bleh. "Pardon," she said. "I ain't myself quite." She leaned forward and vomited copiously on the floor. Copious means a lot, to give a lot. So when you have a copious amount of something, it's quite a bit. So she vomited, she threw up, and there was a lot. That's what copious means here. That's better, she said, leaning back with closed eyes. Never keep it down. That's what I say. Get it up while it's fresh in your stomach, like. So whatever she vomited, maybe they gave her something, and she vomited, and she said, "Now I feel better. Never keep that sort of thing in your stomach. Let it go right away." She revived, turned to have another look at Winston, and seemed immediately to take a fancy to him. That means it seems like immediately she liked him. She put a vast arm around his shoulder and drew him towards her. So draw means like to bring near. That's one of the ways that you can use draw. I know that you know draw as making a picture, but draw can mean other things. And so she put her arm around him and she drew him near her. So she brought him close to her. Breathing beer and vomit into his face. "What's your name, dearie?" she said. "Smith," said Winston. "Smith?" said the woman. "That's funny. My name's Smith, too. Why," she added sentimentally, "I might be your mother." She might, thought Winston, be his mother. She was about the right age and physique, and it was probable that people changed somewhat after 20 years in a forced labor camp. No one else had spoken to him. To a surprising extent, the ordinary criminals ignored the party prisoners. The Polts, they called them. With a sort of uninterested contempt. Contempt means hate. So it wasn't just that they called them the Polts. They would say the Polts. So that's contempt. Contempt means like a feeling of hate. The party prisoners seemed terrified of speaking to anybody, and above all of speaking to one another. Only once, when two party members, both women, were pressed together on the bench, he overheard, amid the din of voices, a few hurriedly whispered words, and, in particular, a reference to something called Room 101. Well, you know, in English, we don't like to say the word 0. We prefer to say the word 1. Oh. So this is room 101. But you always would read that as 101. You would never say 101. You could, but that's just very strangely specific. Most of the time, you would read that as O, like the letter O. Which he did not understand. It might be 2 or 3 hours ago that they had brought him here. The dull pain in his belly never went away, but sometimes it grew better and sometimes it grew worse, and his thoughts expanded or contracted accordingly. When it grew worse, he thought only of the pain itself and of his desire for food. When it grew better, panic took hold of him. There were moments when he foresaw. So, foresee means to predict. For in front and see in front, see into the future. When he foresaw the things that would happen to him with such actuality that his heart galloped and his breath stopped. Gallop is like the running of an animal. So you could say run, but when you say the word gallop, I immediately think of a horse. So if you think of the way a horse runs, that's galloping. So his heart galloped. His heart was running very fast, and his breath stopped. He felt the smash of truncheons on his elbows and iron-shod boots on his shins. He saw himself groveling on the floor, screaming for mercy through broken teeth. He had already thought of Julia. He hardly thought of Julia. He could not fix his mind on her. He loved her and would not betray her, but that was only a fact known as he knew the rules of arithmetic. Wait, let me read that again. He loved her and would not betray her, but that was only a fact known as he knew the rules of arithmetic. He felt no love for her, and he hardly even wondered what was happening to her. He thought oftener of O'Brien with a flicking hope. O'Brien might know that he had been arrested. The Brotherhood, he had said, never tried to save its members. But there was a razor blade. They would send the razor blade if they could. There would be perhaps 5 seconds before the guard could rush into the cell. The blade would bite into him with a sort of burning coldness, and even the fingers that held it would be cut to the bone. Everything came back to his sick body, which shrank, trembling from the smallest pain. Trembling is moving like this, like shaking, but very small shakes. He was not certain that he would use the razor blade, even if he got the chance. It was more natural to exist from moment to moment, accepting another 10 minutes' life, even with the certainty that there was torture at the end of it. Sometimes he tried to calculate the number of porcelain bricks on the walls of the cell. It should have been easy, but he always lost count at some point or another. More often he wondered where he was and what time of day it was. At one moment he felt certain that it was broad daylight outside, and at the next equally certain that it was pitch darkness. In this place, he knew instinctively, the lights would never be turned on. It was the place with no darkness. He saw now why O'Brien seemed to recognize the allusion. In the Ministry of Love, there were no windows. His cell might be at the heart of the building or against its outer wall. It might be 10 floors below ground or 30 above. He moved himself mentally from place to place and tried to determine by the feeling of his body whether he was perched high in the air or buried deep underground. Well, let's look at that word perch for a minute. Perching is what birds do. So if you look at this picture of a bird, it's not exactly standing or sitting, it's what birds do in a high place. And this wooden structure that you see the bird is sitting on, that is called a bird perch. And the bird is perching on the thing. So you talk about something being perched because it's very high up like a bird, sitting very high up like a bird. And Winston didn't know if he was underground or if he was perched high, if he was sitting very high up in a place like a bird. Let's just read that sentence again. He moved himself mentally from place to place and tried to determine by the feeling of his body whether he was perched high in the air or buried deep underground. There was a sound of marching boots outside. The steel door opened with a clang. A young officer, a trim black uniformed figure who seemed to glitter all over with polished leather. Remember that word glitter. So he's reflecting light, but in a lot of different places. Like glitter, like the noun. All over with polished leather. And whose pale, straight-featured face was like a wax mask, stepped smartly through the doorway. He motioned to the guards outside to bring the prisoner they were leading. So motioning to the guards, that what I picture, he's doing something like this. Like, come this way. The poet Ampleforth shambled into the cell. The door clanged shut again. Ampleforth made one or two uncertain movements from side to side, as though having some idea that there was another door to go out of. Wait a minute. Ampleforth made one or two uncertain movements from side to side, as though having some idea that there was another door to go out of, and then began to wander up and down the cell. So he was looking for another door so he could leave. He had not yet noticed Winston's presence. His troubled eyes were gazing at the wall above about a meter high above the level of Winston's heads. He was shoeless. Large, dirty toes were sticking out of the holes in his socks. He was already 7 days away from a shave. A scrubby beard covered his face to the cheekbones, giving him an air of ruffianism that went oddly with his large, weak frame and nervous movements. Winston roused himself. There's some misprints here. Winston roused himself a little from his lethargy. So lethargy is feeling tired, no energy. So Winston is sitting there very tired or no energy. But he sees someone he knows, so he tries to sit up. He tries to get that energy. Rouse means come up. So Winston tried to come up from his tiredness. He must speak to Ampleforth and risk the yell from the telescreen. It was even conceivable that Ampleforth was the bearer of the razor blade. So remember, to bear something means to carry something or to hold something. So, and a lot of times we see bear meaning I can't tolerate it, which means I can't carry it, I can't hold it. But here it really does mean carrier. It means the holder of the razor blade. Ampleforth, he said. There was no yell from the telescreen. Ampleforth paused, mildly startled. Startled means surprised. His eyes focused themselves slowly on Winston. Ah, Smith, he said. You too? What are you in for? To tell you the truth. He sat down awkwardly on the bench opposite Winston. There's only one offense, is there not? He said. And you have committed it? Apparently I have. He put a hand to his forehead and pressed his temples for a moment. These are your temples. Here's your forehead, and these are your temples. So he put a hand to his forehead and pressed his temples for a moment, as though trying to remember something. These things happen, he began vaguely. I have been able to recall one instance. Recall means remember. A possible instance it was, an indiscretion undoubtedly. We were producing a definitive edition of the poems of Kipling. I allowed the word God to remain at the end of the line. I could not help it, he added, almost indignantly. Indignant means that you're kind of angry. You're kind of you're angry, and you don't understand why people don't understand your anger. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, I couldn't help it. Like, why are they mad at me? I was doing the right thing. So when you're indignant, you're angry because you believe you're doing the right thing, and everybody else is wrong. I couldn't help it. Raising his face to look at Winston, it was impossible to change the line. The rhyme was rod. Do you realize that there are only 12 rhymes to rod in the entire language? For days I had racked my brains. To rack your brains means to think very hard. Actually, I want to put that up here. That's kind of a good expression to practice. It's pretty common to rack my brain. Whoops, let me change that. That means to make your brain work really hard, to think really hard about something, to rack my brains. For days I had racked my brains. There was no other rhyme. The expression on his face changed. The annoyance passed out of it, and for a moment he looked almost pleased, a sort of intellectual warmth, the joy of the pedant who has found out some useless fact shone through the dirt and scrubby hair. Has it ever occurred to you, he said, that the whole history of English poetry has been determined by the fact that the English language lacks rhymes? No, that particular thought had never occurred to Winston, nor in the circumstances did it strike him as a very important or interesting. Do you know what time of day it is? He said. Ampleforth looked startled again, startled as surprised. I hardly thought about it. They arrested me. It could be 2 days ago, perhaps 3. His eyes flitted round the walls, as though he half expected to find a window somewhere. There is no difference between night and day in this place. I do not see how one can calculate the time. They talked desultorily for a moment. Okay, we have to look up this word desultorily. I have no idea what that means. So I don't think this is necessarily a vocabulary word. It's certainly not a common word. Let's see, desultory. Lacking a plan, purpose, or enthusiasm. They talked desultorily for a minute. So maybe that means they talked with no point or no objective. And then, without apparent reason, a yell came from the telescreen, bade them both to be silent. To bid someone to do something is to tell someone to do something. It's not very common to use bid as a verb in that way now, but you can see that word used in other things like forbid. If something is forbidden, you are already told not to do it. For means before, and bid means tell. So forbid means already told, already warned. And here, here they are using bid as a verb, like tell. A yell from the telescreen bade them. So you have bid, bade, bidden, forbidden, forbade. So telling them, ordered them. A yell from the telescreen ordered them, bade them to be silent. Winston sat quietly, his hands crossed. Ampleforth, too large to sit in comfort on the narrow bench, fidgeted. Fidgeting is when you can't stop moving. You're always moving something. So Ampleforth was, I guess, large, and the bench was very uncomfortable, so he's always trying to readjust his body, which means he's fidgeting. Fidgeting from side to side. Clasping his lank hands first round the knee, then round the other, the telescreen barked at him. Barking is what a dog does. Woof, woof, woof. So that's if the telescreen is barking at him, it's telling him to do things, but in a very horrible way, a very unfriendly way, a very mean way. Keep still. Time passed, 20 minutes, an hour. It was difficult to judge. Once more there was a sound of boots outside. Winston's entrails, that means like your insides, like your intestines and your stomach. Winston's entrails contracted. Soon, very soon, perhaps in 5 minutes, perhaps now, the tramp of boots would mean that his own turn had come. The tramp of boots is the sound. Vroom, 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 vroom. That's tramping. So the tramp of boots, that sound, would mean that his own turn had come. The door opened. The cold-faced young officer stepped into the cell. With a brief movement of the hand, he indicated Ampleforth. Room 101, he said. Ampleforth marched clumsily out between the guards, his face vaguely perturbed. To be perturbed means to be annoyed. But uncomprehending, but he didn't understand. So he looked annoyed and confused, basically. What seemed like a long time passed. The pain in Winston's belly had revived. His mind sagged round and round on the same trick, like a ball falling again and again into the same stories and the same series of slots. He had only 6 thoughts. The pain in his belly, a piece of bread, the blood, and the screaming. O'Brien, Julia, and the razor blade. There was another spasm in his entails, so that's like your digestive system, where your food goes. And a spasm is like a quick movement. So he's very hungry, so his stomach or his digestive system is moving, giving spasms sometimes, little movements. The heavy boots were approaching. As the door opened, the wave of hair that it created brought in a powerful smell of cold sweat. Parsons walked into the cell. He was wearing khaki shorts and a sports shirt. This time Winston was startled into self-forgetfulness. "You? Here?" he said. Parsons gave Winston a glance in which there was neither interest nor surprise, but only misery. He began walking jerkily up and down, evidently unable to keep still. Each time he straightened his pudgy knees. Pudgy is another word for, if you know the word chubby. So you have the word fat, which isn't really a nice word to say, to call someone fat. But if you say that someone is, well, don't call people pudgy. Don't do that. But if you say chubby or pudgy, that's a little bit softer. It doesn't mean extremely fat. It means like a little fat. And pudgy also means like a little fat, not super fat. So pudgy can actually be cute. But don't do it. Don't use it. You never know when somebody might be offended by that. But I don't think it's a bad word. Each time his pudgy knees, he straightened his pudgy knees, it was apparent that they were trembling. His eyes had a wide open staring look. To stare is to just concentrate on something. Looking and concentrating. So his eyes had a wide staring look. You know, that's what happens when people are in shock. They just sit there. As though he could not prevent himself from gazing at something in the middle distance. "What are you in for?" said Winston. "Thought crime," said Parsons, almost blubbering. To blubber, blubbering is a type of crying with a lot of sounds like that's blubbering. So thought crimes, said Parsons, almost blubbering. The tone of his voice implied at once a complete admission of his guilt and a sort of incredulous horror. To be incredulous means I can't believe it. If you have a credo, I believe, that's Latin, and incredo, I don't believe. So incredulous means I don't believe it. I can't believe it. He's incredulous. So if you say something incredulous, you're saying it like, I'm shocked. I can't believe it. What did he say incredulously? Thought crimes? I don't know. I can't be incredulous. I'm not an actor. He paused opposite Winston and began eagerly appealing to him. Eager means very enthusiastically, very strongly. You don't think they'll shoot me, do you, old chap? They don't shoot you if you haven't actually done anything, only thoughts, which you can't help. I know they give you a fair hearing. Oh, I trust them for that. They'll know my record, won't they? You know what kind of chap I was. Not a bad chap in my way. Not brainy, of course, but keen. Keen means to be like enthusiastic, like always willing to help, always willing to do the right thing. I tried to do my best for the party, didn't I? I'll get off with 5 years, don't you think? Or even 10 years. A chap like me could make himself pretty useful in labor camp. They wouldn't shoot me for going off the rails just once. So poor Parsons, he really thinks that the party will forgive him. But I think Winston, let's see what he says, but I think Winston is thinking, oh, you poor idiot, you have no idea. Are you guilty? Said Winston. Of course I'm guilty, cried Parsons with a servile glance at the telescreen. You don't think the party would arrest an innocent man, do you? His frog-like face grew calmer and even took on a slightly sanctimonious expression. To be sanctimonious is to be right, to feel like you're right, and to make it clear to other people that you believe you're right. and that they're probably wrong, or that they're surprised that you don't agree with them. Oh, wait, I'm not really happy with my definition of sanctimonious. Let me... Sanctimonious. Let's check it. Making a show of being morally superior to other people. So Parsons is kind of shocked that Winston would even question that he's guilty. Of course I'm guilty. What? They would never arrest someone who isn't guilty. Thought crime is a dreadful thing. Dreadful means horrible. Thought crime is a dreadful thing, old man, he said sententiously. It's insidious. It can get hold of you without your even knowing it. Do you know how it got hold of me? In my sleep. Yes, that's a fact. There I was, working away, trying to do my bit. Never knew I had any bad stuff in my mind at all, and then I started talking in my sleep. Do you know what they heard me saying? He sank his voice, like someone who is obliged, for medical reasons, to utter an obscenity. Down with Big Brother. Yes, I said that. Said it over and over again. It seems, between you and me, old man, I'm glad they got me before I went any further. Do you know what I'm going to say to them when I go up before the tribunal? Thank you. I'm going to say thank you for saving me before it was too late. Who denounced you? Said Winston. It was my little daughter, said Parsons with a sort of doleful pride. To dole over something is like to adore something. So if he said my daughter in a doleful pride, it would be like, my daughter, I love her so much. She listened at the keyhole, heard what I was saying, and nipped off to the patrols the very next day. Pretty smart for a nipper of 7, eh? I don't bear her any grudge for it. In fact, I'm proud of her. It shows I brought her up right, in the right spirit anyway. He made a few jerky movements. A jerky movement is a very quick movement. That's jerking. So he made a few jerky movements up and down several times, casting a longing glance at the lavatory pan. Do you remember earlier in the chapter we talked about longing? To long for something is to desire something very strongly. Oh, I long for some ice cream. I long for some pizza. So it means it's a very, very strong desire for something. And here we have longing again. He's looking at the lavatory pan, so it's just a pot for going to the bathroom, and he's looking at it with very strong desire, hopefully because he has to go to the bathroom. So he's kind of looking at it thinking, oh, I've got to go to the bathroom. I can't go to the bathroom in front of Winston, but he's looking at it and he's jerking around like he has to go. He made a few more jerky movements up and down several times, casting a longing glance at the lavatory pan. And then he suddenly ripped down his shorts. Excuse me, old man, he said. I can't help it. It's the waiting. He pumped his large posterior, that means bottom, into the lavatory pan. Winston covered his face with his hands. Smith, yelled the voice from the telescreen. 6079 Smith W. Uncover your face. No faces covered in the cells. Winston uncovered his face. Parsons used the lavatory loudly and abundantly. So you know loud. Abundant means very much, very strongly, in a large quantity. And then he turned out that the plug was defective, and the cell stank abominably for hours. And then turned out that the plug was so actually it wasn't just a pot. I thought it was just a pot on the floor, but actually it's attached to the system. Unfortunately, though, it was clogged. It was stuck, so nothing could go down. And the cell stank abominably, that means horribly, for hours afterwards. Parsons was removed. More prisoners came and went. Mysteriously, a woman who was consigned to room 101, and Winston noticed, seemed to shrivel and turn a different color when she heard the words. Shrivel means to become smaller, like shrink. So when she heard that she was going to sell 101, she became smaller and turn a different color in her face when she heard the words. A time came, if it had been morning, when he was brought here. It would be afternoon. Wait, let me read that again. A time came when, if it had been morning, when he was brought here, it would be afternoon. Or if it had been afternoon, it would be midnight. So maybe 12 hours passed, or so. He knew that several hours passed, and depending on when he arrived at the jail, it would either be the morning or the middle of the night. Oh, Still Waters Run Deep says, "Thank you, sir. You are an outstanding English teacher." Well, I'm glad that you're here, Still Waters. I hope that you keep watching. And if you're watching now, asking questions when you don't understand something or you want more information. So I encourage you to ask questions while we do this. Okay, there were 6 prisoners in the cell. Men and women all sat very still. Opposite Winston, there sat a man with a chinless, toothy face, exactly like that of some large, harmless rodent. So a chinless face, this is your chin. He didn't have a chin. And it says toothy, so he must have had very big teeth. Opposite there sat a man with a chinless, toothy face, like that of some harmless rodent. A rodent is a type of animal like a mouse or a rat. And harmless means it would never hurt you. So he looked, because he didn't have a chin and he had very big teeth, he looked like a rat or a mouse, but not in a scary way. His fat, mottled cheeks were so pouched at the bottom that it was difficult not to believe that it had little stores of food tucked away in it. Let's look at the word pouch for a moment. Pouch. A pouch is like a bag. So if we look at the word pouch, if we look at pictures of the word pouch, we see things in bags. These are all pouches. Pouch is a kind of bag. But they're talking about pouched cheeks. So let's see what happens if we type pouch. These are cheeks here. So cheeks like a bag. Let's see. And of course, the first thing you see is like a chipmunk. That's what they do, because they use their cheeks like a bag. I don't know if all rodents do that, but see, but you can even see this picture of a man, and his cheeks look like bags holding something. So those are pouched cheeks. His pale gray eyes flitted timorously from face to face and turned quickly away again when he caught anyone's eye. So he didn't like to make eye contact with people. He didn't like to meet people in the eye. He was afraid. The door opened and another prisoner was brought in, whose appearance sent a momentary chill through Winston. He was a commonplace, mean-looking man who might have been an engineer or technician of some kind. But what was startling, surprising, was the emaciation of his face. Emaciated means, like, if you don't eat food, then you can start to see the bones of the body. So I'm very fat, but if I didn't eat for a month or two, you could see the shape of my bones, of my face, or of my body. So his face looked emaciated. It looked like he didn't eat for a very long time. It was like a skull. Because of its thinness, the mouth, the eyes, looked disproportionately large, and the eyes seemed filled with a murderous, unappeasable hatred of somebody or something. So this man who they brought in was very angry about something or someone. The man sat down on the bench a little distance from Winston. Winston did not look at him again, but the tormented skull-like face was as vivid in his mind as though it had been straight in front of his eyes. Suddenly he realized what was the matter. The man was dying of starvation. The same thought seemed to occur to almost simultaneously to everyone in the cell. There was a very faint stirring. We've had that word stir many times in this book. Stir means to move, and faint means weak. So there was a little movement, a little moving. All the way around the bench, the eyes of the chinless man kept flitting towards the skull-faced, then turning guiltily away, then being dragged back by an irresistible attraction. Presently, he began to fidget in his seat. Remember, fidget is making little movements with your body. He began to fidget in his seat. At last he stood up, waddled clumsily across the cell, dug down into the pocket of his overalls, and with an abashed air held out a grimy piece of bread to the skull-faced man. Let's take a look at that word waddle for a minute, because I'm pretty sure you don't know that word. Maybe you do, but I'm sure that there is some. Waddling is a way of walking, and especially if you're fat, you might waddle. So this is, look how a penguin walks. That's waddling. So this is a penguin waddling. And I think that the man with the rodent face, with the rat face, is kind of fat from the way Winston describes him. So that's why he waddled over to the starving man and pulled out some bread. Grimy means greasy or dirty. So it was not a very nice piece of bread, but it was all that the rat man had. There was a furious, deafening roar from the telescreen. Furious means extremely angry, and deafening, if you know the word deaf, deaf means that's what you call someone who doesn't have the ability to hear. You say that they're deaf. Deaf means can't hear. And by putting an en at the end of it, it makes it a verb. It means like make can't hear. So if something is deafening, it's so loud that maybe afterwards you can't hear anything. Like, did you ever go somewhere where they have big speakers and they play very loud music, and then later it's difficult to hear? That's deafening music. Or it could be so loud you don't hear other things. Did you ever go somewhere where you try to have a conversation with someone, but the music is so loud, or the people talking around you is so loud, you can't hear your conversation? That's deafening loud. So there was a deafening roar from the telescreen. The chinless man jumped in his tracks. The skull-faced man had quickly thrust his hands behind his back, as though demonstrating to all the world that he refused the gift. "Bumstead!" roared the voice. 2713 Bumstead J. Let fall that piece of bread. The chinless man dropped the piece of bread on the floor. "Remain standing where you are," said the voice. "Face the door. Make no movement." The chinless man obeyed. His large, pouchy cheeks were quivering uncontrollably. Quivering is a very fast movement like this. It's quivering. The door clanged open as the young officer entered and stepped aside. There emerged from behind him a short, stumpy guard with enormous arms and shoulders. Stumpy to me means short, so I picture well, actually, here, wait. Let's take a look at what a stump is. I would think maybe short and fat, because here's a stump. See, this is a tree stump. They're always very big. So, and short. So if someone is stumpy, it means maybe they have like very short arms and legs, and they're kind of fat, like this. It's not nice to call someone stumpy, by the way. So don't do it, unless you want to make someone angry. You're stumpy. The door clanged open as the young officer entered and stepped aside. There emerged from behind him a short, stumpy guard with enormous arms and shoulders. That's kind of a contradiction. So maybe they were just fat legs and fat arms. He took his side opposite the chinless man, and then at a signal from the officer, let free a frightful blow. A blow is a hit. So the stumpy guard hit the chipmunk man, the rat man. The force of it seemed almost to knock him clear on the floor. His body was flung across the cell and fetched up against the base of the lavatory seat. When you fling something, that's like throwing it, and it's an irregular verb. Fling, flang, flung. That means like thrown. So his body was flung across the cell, thrown across the cell, and fetched up against the base of the lavatory seat. For a moment, he lay as though stunned. Stunned means like surprised or shocked, with dark blood oozing from his mouth and nose. Oozing is when liquid comes out very slowly. So there wasn't blood coming out a lot. It was just kind of coming out very slowly. A very faint whimpering or squeaking. Whimpering is a type of crying, like that's a whimper. And squeaking is like the sound of a mouse or a rat. It's kind of a high-pitched noise. That's a squeak. Which seemed unconscious, came out of him. And then he rolled over and raised himself unsteadily on hands and knees. Amid a stream of blood and saliva, the two halves of a dental plate fell out of his mouth. The prisoners sat very still, their hands crossed on their knees. The chinless man climbed back into his place. Down one side of his face, the flesh was darkening. His mouth had swollen into a shapeless, cherry-colored mass with a black hole in the middle of it. From time to time, a little blood dripped onto the breast of his overalls. His gray eyes still flitted from face to face, more guiltily than ever, as though he were trying to discover how much the others despised him for his humiliation. The door opened. With a small gesture, the officer indicated to the skull-faced man. "Room 101, he said. There was a gasp and a flurry at Winston's side. The man had actually flung himself on his knees on the floor with his hand clasped together. "Comrade, officer," he cried. "You don't have to take me to that place. Haven't I told you everything already? What else is it you want to know? There was nothing I wouldn't confess. Nothing. Just tell me what it is. I'll confess straight off. Write it down and I'll sign it. Anything. Not room 101. Room 101, said the officer. The man's face, already very pale, turned a color Winston would not have believed possible. It was definitely, unmistakably, a shade of green. "Do anything to me," he yelled. "You've been starving me for weeks. Finish it off. Let me die. Shoot me. Hang me. Sentence me to 25 years. Is there somebody else you want me to give away? Just say who it is, and I'll tell you anything you want." "I don't care who it is or what you do to them. I've got a wife and 3 children. The biggest of them isn't 6 years old. You can't take the whole lot of them and cut their throats in front of my eyes." You can take the whole lot of them and cut their throats in front of my eyes, and I'll stand by and watch, but not room 101. "Room 101, said the officer. The man looked frantically round at the other prisoners, as though with some idea that he could put another victim in his own place. His eyes settled on the smashed face of the chinless man. He flung out a lean arm. "That's the one you ought to be taking, not me," he shouted. "You didn't hear what he was saying after they bashed his face." "Give me a chance and I'll tell you every word of it. He's the one that's against the party, not me." The guard stepped forward. The man's voice rose to a shriek. "You didn't hear him?" He repeated. "Something went wrong with the telescreen. He's the one you want. Take him, not me." The two sturdy guards, sturdy means very strong, very stable and strong, had stooped to take him by the arms. But just at this moment, he flung himself across the cell of the floor and grabbed one of the iron legs that supported the bench. He had set up a wordless howling, like an animal. Howling is the sound of like a wolf or a dog. Ow! That's howling. He had set up a wordless howling like an animal. The guards took hold of him to wrench him loose, but he clung with astonishing strength for perhaps 20 seconds. They were hauling at him, pulling at him. The prisoners sat quiet, their hands crossed on their knees, looking straight in front of them. The howling stopped. The man had no breath left for anything except hanging on. And then there was a different kind of cry. A kick from the guard's boot had broken the fingers of one of his hands, and they dragged him to his feet. "Room 101, said the officer. The man was led out, walking unsteadily with head sunken, nursing his crushed hand. To nurse something is to take care of it. So he was doing this, maybe, like trying to make his hand feel better. That's nursing something. All the fight had gone out of him. A long time passed. If it had been midnight when the skull-faced man was taken away, it was morning. If morning, it was afternoon. Winston was alone. He had been alone for hours. The pain of sitting on that narrow bench was such that often he got up and walked about unreproved by the telescreen. The piece of bread still lay where the chinless man had dropped it. At the beginning, it needed a hard effort not to look at it, but presently hunger gave way to thirst. His mouth was sticky and evil-tasting. The humming sound and the unvarying white light induced a sort of faintness, an empty feeling inside his head. He would get up, because the ache in his bones was no longer bearable, and then he would sit down again almost at once, because he was too dizzy to make sure that of staying on his feet. Dizzy is when you feel like everything is moving in a circle and you can't stand. That's feeling dizzy. Whenever his physical sensations were a little under control, the terror returned. Sometimes with a fading hope, he thought of O'Brien and the razor blade. It was unthinkable that the razor blade might arrive concealed in his food, if he were ever fed. More dimly, he thought of Julia, somewhere or other. She was suffering perhaps far worse than he. She might be screaming with pain at this moment. He thought, if I could save Julia by doubling my own pain, I would do it. Yes, I would. But that was merely an intellectual decision, taken because he knew that he ought to take it. He did not feel it. In this place, you could not feel anything except pain and foreknowledge. So remember, we've seen like foresee means to predict, see in front, and foreknowledge means like to know in advance. Besides, was it possible when you were actually suffering it to wish for any reason that your own pain should increase? But that question was not answerable yet. The boots were approaching again. The door opened. O'Brien came in. Winston started to his feet. Now, we've had that word before. Of course, you know that start means begin, but also it means to be surprised. So the example I like to use is if you're falling asleep and you're almost there and then you hear a noise, you start. That's starting. It's like being surprised and moving. So when Winston started to his feet, it means he jumped up in surprise. It doesn't mean he began. It means he jumped up in surprise. The shock of the sight had driven all caution out of him. For the first time in many years, he forgot the presence of the telescreen. They got you too? He cried. They got me a long time ago, said O'Brien with a mild, almost regretful irony. He stepped aside. From behind him there emerged a broad-chested guard with a long black truncheon in his hand. You know this, Winston, said O'Brien. Don't deceive yourself. You did know it. You've always known it. Yes, he saw now. He had always known it. But there was no time to think of that. All he had eyes for was the truncheon. So that's like a baton or a bat to hit you with. All he saw was the truncheon in the guard's hand. It might fall anywhere. On the crown, on the tip of the ear, on the upper arm, on the elbow. The elbow. He had slumped to his knees, almost paralyzed, clasping the stricken elbow with his other hand, like this. Everything had exploded into yellow light. Inconceivable that one blow could cause such pain. The light cleared, and he could see the other two looking down at him. The guard was laughing at his contortions. One question, at any rate, was answered. Never, for any reason on earth, could you wish for an increase of pain. Of pain, you could only wish for one thing, that it should stop. Nothing in the world was so bad as physical pain. In the face of pain, there are no heroes. No heroes, he thought, over and over. He writhed on the floor. That means maybe he moved like a snake. He moved like a snake on the floor, clutching, that means holding, uselessly his disabled arm. All right, well, that was the end of Chapter 1 of Part 3 of 1984. And I want to thank everyone who stayed and watched to the end. And I hope that you will come back and continue this story with me when we read Chapter 2 of Part 3 of 1984 of George Orwell. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And I hope to see you again very soon.